Welcome back to another astonishing story from Olympics history.
The year was 1904, and the Olympics were being held outside Europe, in St. Louis, Missouri to be specific, for the very first time.
From the outset, you need to know that the Olympics of today, with their slick pageantry and lavish opening and closing ceremonies, to say nothing of athletes and judges at the pinnacle of their craft, and millions of dollars invested in high-tech gear and attire, was still decades away. Hell, we're still 20 years away from the creation of the Winter Olympics, my favorite Olympics. The early modern games were frequently, well, a mess, and 1904 was certainly no exception.
The Russo-Japanese War meant that it was too difficult or dangerous for many European athletes to even make the trip. In the end, of the 651 competitors, only 70 or so hailed from outside North America.
For today's story, I want to focus on just one event, the marathon. Well, it's been overshadowed by glitzier sports these days. The marathon was, and remains, a cornerstone Olympics event, linking the modern games to those of ancient Greece. Unfortunately, the 1904 marathon was more of a bonkers carnival show than a venerated contest of athleticism.
Amongst the favorites for the Americans were experienced marathoners Thomas Hicks, Sam Meller, and John Lorden. Few knew New Yorker Fred Lors, a bricklayer by day and a runner at night. Felix Carvajal hailed from Cuba. He arrived in New Orleans, promptly lost all of his money gambling, and had to hitchhike to St. Louis. He showed up to the starting line dressed in long dark pants, a long-sleeve white shirt, dress shoes, and a hat. One of his competitors took pity on him and cut his trousers into shorts. There were also two contenders from South Africa, at least one of whom was running barefoot. They were the first black Africans to ever participate in the modern Olympics, and, in fact, were the only black athletes to represent South Africa until the fall of apartheid in 1990. The race began just after 3 o'clock on August 30th. The temperature had soared into the low 90s, and the humidity was nearly unbearable. Unlike today, the public wasn't secured from the course. The runners had to dodge automobiles, trolley cars, trains, and pedestrians all along their route. The mostly dirt roads, often several inches deep in dust, occasionally gave way to cracked stone, making for unstable and treacherous terrain. Oh, and they had to climb 7 hills, varying in height from 100 to 300 feet, often with brutally steep ascents. To make matters even worse, James Sullivan, the chief organizer of the games, had some rather odd ideas. "Don't get into the habit of drinking and eating in the marathon race," he once said. "Some prominent runners do, but it's not beneficial."
Wanting to study how elite athletes dealt with dehydration, he mandated that the only water available to the racers wasn't to be until 12 miles in.
So it's hardly surprising that American William Garcia collapsed 8 miles from the finish line. He began coughing up blood and was found unconscious on the side of the road. There was so much dust in his esophagus that it ripped a hole in his stomach lining, causing severe hemorrhaging. He nearly bled to death. Lorden, who I mentioned earlier was one of the favorites, gave up after suffering a fit of vomiting. A wild dog chased one of the South African racers a mile off course. And Bronx bricklayer Fred Lors gave in to cramps and caught a ride in a passing car for 11 miles, waving at spectators and fellow runners as he passed by. He jogged the last mile on foot, entering the stadium to a tumult of cheers. He'd just had his photograph taken with Alice Roosevelt, daughter of then-President Theodore Roosevelt, and was standing on the podium ready to accept his gold medal when officials learned he'd cheated. He was promptly disqualified.
If you think all of that's unbelievable, you haven't heard anything yet.
Despite running in street clothes, Cuban Felix Carvajal led for a large portion of the race. He was doing so well, in fact, that at one point he stopped to chat with spectators. A bit further down the course, he came across some people who were eating peaches. Felix hadn't eaten in 40 hours and was desperate for food. He asked for some of their fruit, and when they refused, he swiped their peaches and continued running. Felix clearly loved his fruit because after he finished the peaches, he passed an apple orchard and began gorging himself. The only problem was the apples were rotten, and soon Felix was beset with such bad stomach cramps that he had to stop and take a nap. That allowed American Sam Meller to catch up and take the lead, but it wasn't long before his side stitches grew so bad that he dropped out of the race.
Of all the presumed frontrunners, that left only Thomas Hicks.
7 miles from the finish, Hicks came across 2 of his support staff and began begging them for some water. They refused. Instead, they gave him a mixture of egg whites and strychnine, which, in small doses, was a commonly used stimulant. There were no rules against performance-enhancing drugs at this time, and this is the first recorded instance of drug use in the modern age of the Olympics.
If you're thinking, wait, I thought strychnine was a rat poison, you're right.
Hicks's complexion grew pale, and he began stumbling badly. His trainers decided that what he needed were more egg whites and strychnine, and a little bit of brandy to wash it all down. 2 miles from the finish line, one race official said that Hicks's eyes were, quote, dull and lusterless. The ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff. As he neared the stadium and the finish tape, Hicks began to hallucinate. There was not a semblance of the elastic spring with which he had started, wrote the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. He didn't look up once when the din was at its height. He was within a few yards of the finish. His lower jaw was hanging as if in imbecility. His eyes stared blankly, but his pitiful expression didn't change. Hicks's coaching staff had to literally carry him over the line, his feet pumping the empty air beneath him as if he were still running. Hicks was declared the winner and carried off the field on a stretcher. It took 4 doctors to save him.
Had he received even one more dose, Hicks likely would have died. Over the course of that single afternoon, he lost 8 pounds.
Hicks won the 1904 Olympic Marathon with a time of 3 hours, 28 minutes, and 53 seconds, the slowest winning time in Olympic history by more than half an hour. Felix managed to wake up from his nap just in time to grab 4th place. South African Jan Mashiane arrived in 9th place, despite running barefoot and earlier being chased off course by a dog. Of the 32 runners who started the race, only 14 finished, the lowest number in Olympic history. The Post-Dispatch dubbed the race a, quote, man-killing event. The next day, people began arguing that marathons were too dangerous and should be struck from the Olympics. James Sullivan, the guy who refused to make water available to the racers, called the event, quote, indefensible. He said that, quote, a 25-mile run is asking too much of human endurance.
Obviously, the marathon remains a key part of the Olympics and is frequently the final event before the closing ceremonies. But 4 years later, in 1908 at the London Games, only one of the 32 runners from St. Louis returned to compete. See you tomorrow for another amazing story from the Olympic Games. Stay curious, my friends.